They told you she vanished into thin air. They told you the doors were locked, the snow untouched, the gown still warm. They did not tell you what was under the floorboards of that mansion, or whose hands built the cage she lived in. On a black December morning in 1887, Pittsburgh awoke to a silence that would never be broken. Cornelius Vandemark, steel magnate, political kingmaker, and man feared in every boardroom east of Chicago, descended the marble staircase of his Fifth Avenue fortress. He was expecting the day's first letters, a fresh fire in the study, perhaps the rustle of his wife's dress in the corridor. Instead, he saw it, her emerald evening gown spread like a ritual offering on the Persian rug, beads glimmering in the half-light, still warm against the cold air. Evangeline Vandemark was gone. The front door was bolted from the inside, windows sealed, the snow outside unbroken. Use, Sackwood. 12 servants swore they heard nothing, saw nothing. 4 hours earlier, 3 of them had watched her go to bed in that same gown. By morning, it lay empty. The police, bound by his influence, declared insufficient evidence after 6 days. But what they never uncovered was this. Evangeline's disappearance was not the crime. It was the conclusion. For 2 years, she had been walking an invisible plank toward this moment, her every step watched by the most ruthless industrial mind of the Gilded Age. Vandemark's empire was built in blood, the kind that dripped behind factory walls, the kind that never made the papers because the men who owned the presses owed him everything. His rivals didn't just lose contracts, they lost their lives. And in his home under his roof, his young wife had begun collecting proof. Her father's death, ruled an accident in a Boston bank fire, was the spark. She had married Cornelius believing him a builder, a visionary. What she found was a predator in a tailored suit. From the moment she discovered the pattern of accidents, foreshadowing his rise, she became a liability. That gown in the foyer was not just clothing. It was a message to those who could read it. A signal that the final move in a much older game had been made. And once you see what was really in play that winter, you'll understand why Evangeline's fate was sealed long before that morning. You think disappearances are random. They are not. They are orchestrations, performances staged so precisely that even the air in the room becomes part of the lie. Pittsburgh in the winter of 1887 was a kingdom of fire and smoke. Steel and coal turned men into gods and corpses with equal efficiency. The air itself was a choking mixture of ambition and soot. And in that blackened city, Cornelius Vandemark ruled like a monarch whose court was made of bankers, railroad tycoons, and men who had never dirtied their hands but had signed enough papers to ruin thousands. His mansion was a fortress, a Gothic revival masterpiece stretching 4 stories above Fifth Avenue. Towers and turrets cast long shadows over the Allegheny River, and gargoyles imported from France crouched above the entryway like watchmen of some older, darker order. Inside, the walls were lined with oil paintings of industrial conquest, blast furnaces glowing like the gates of hell, ships loaded with his steel cutting through icy waters, workers reduced to anonymous shadows beneath clouds of steam. This was not a home. It was a declaration of dominion. Evangeline entered that world 5 years earlier, a bride from Boston's old money. 20 years younger than her husband, she was the very image of refinement. Auburn hair that caught the light, eyes like polished emeralds, the kind of education and poise that could make a man forget himself. But beneath her grace was a mind sharpened by grief and memory. She had lost her father under circumstances she would later learn were tied, invisibly, to the man she married. At first, she played the role, hostess to the elite, jewel of the ballroom, silent partner in her husband's empire. But her silence did not mean blindness. She noticed things. The way his contracts coincided with accidents that crippled his rivals. The way certain names vanished from guest lists and reappeared only in obituaries. The way men entered meetings with Cornelius and never left the same. By the time Pittsburgh's gossip began whispering about her withdrawal from public life, she had already started her own quiet war. Hours spent in the library, collecting ledgers and newspapers, taking long walks into the working-class neighborhoods her husband avoided, listening to the wives and widows of mill workers speak of boiler explosions and mine collapses that always seemed to benefit the same small circle of men. The closer she came to the truth, the more carefully she was watched. And when Cornelius watched, it was never alone. Every locked door tells a story. But in the Vandemark mansion, the locks were not meant to keep danger out. They were meant to keep secrets in. December 12, 1887, began with the kind of precision only a household ruled by fear can maintain. Margaret Sullivan, the Irish-born housekeeper whose loyalty had been forged over a decade of service, moved silently between the table and the kitchen, watching the two people who controlled her life. Cornelia spoke with theatrical enthusiasm about a new contract with the Pennsylvania Railroad, about expanding steel operations into Ohio and West Virginia. His voice carried the confidence of a man who knew the future already belonged to him. Evangeline sat opposite him, the emerald gown draped over her like a jewel on display. She barely touched her food, answering his remarks with nods, her eyes drifting to the frost-covered windows, as though expecting a figure to emerge from the darkness. Margaret, a woman not easily unnerved, later swore it was the look of someone bracing for impact. Charles Henley, the butler, glided between them, refilling wine glasses, his face as unreadable as polished stone. But he noticed something too. Cornelius's hand kept straying to the pocket of his waistcoat, where a gold watch ticked toward some unspoken appointment. Henley would later recall that his employer's cheer was too deliberate, like an actor hitting his marks. At 9:30, Margaret helped Evangeline prepare for bed. But instead of the soft nightdress she normally wore in private, Evangeline remained in the emerald gown. The fabric shimmered in the lamplight, beadwork scattering reflections across the walls. It was as if she had dressed for a performance no one else could see. As Margaret fastened the final clasp, Evangeline did something she had never done before. She embraced the housekeeper tightly and whispered, "A thank you for your kindness. You've been like a mother to me. You've been like a mother to me." Margaret didn't know it yet, but that was a farewell. Around 11, Thomas Brennan, the groundskeeper, made his final perimeter walk. Through the upstairs window of her study, he saw Evangeline's silhouette, head bent over her writing desk. The movement of her hand was rapid, almost frantic. She was not composing letters, she was racing the clock. What she was writing that night would be the most dangerous document ever produced inside that mansion. And she knew it would seal her fate. A locked room can be an illusion. The real prison is the knowledge you cannot unknow. And Evangeline had already crossed that threshold. Her study was the only space in the Vandemark mansion that bore no trace of her husband's hand. The rest of the house was a monument to his dominance, marble, gilt, and portraits of himself in every phase of conquest. But here, the air smelled faintly of lavender, oil, and old paper. Shelves climbed to the ceiling, packed with leather-bound volumes on industry, law, and history, alongside the poetry and philosophy Cornelius had no patience for. In the desk drawers, hidden behind false panels, she kept the weapons she had been gathering for months: documents, ledgers, letters from widows and former mill workers, newspaper clippings detailing boiler explosions, mine collapses, bridge failures, each neatly annotated with a location, date, and the financial advantage gained by a small, tight-knit group of industrialists. They called themselves nothing officially, but in the margins of certain memos, she had found the phrase "the circle." Her father's name appeared among the earliest entries. The Boston bank fire that claimed his life had been no accident. She had the proof now, a memorandum written in an unfamiliar but identifiable hand, linking the disaster to a hostile takeover of his institution by interests tied to Vandemark's associates. That single sheet of paper had been locked in her desk for weeks, its key, a small brass one, hanging on the chain she now wore beneath her gown. The maps on her wall were marked with tiny red pins, each a point in a web of deliberate destruction. Across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, industrial accidents bloomed like a plague, always followed by property transfers, stock acquisitions, and contracts signed by members of the same hidden cabal. To an untrained eye, they were tragedies of progress. To Evangeline, they were murder for profit. That night, she was distilling it all into a final account: dates, names, methods, a record that could ruin Cornelius and every man in his circle. But she also knew something else. The circle's reach did not end at the factory gates. Police chiefs, judges, politicians, all of them were entangled. If she sent her findings through normal channels, they would vanish along with her. And so she wrote with the urgency of someone who knew her window of survival was measured in hours, not days. Every word she committed to the page was a step closer to the point of no return. Somewhere in the mansion, She could hear the faint click of shoes on marble, slow, measured, coming closer. If you ever feel the walls closing in, remember, someone built them for that purpose. And in the Vandemark mansion, those walls could listen. The sound of footsteps on the marble floor was faint, but in the dead of a Pittsburgh winter night, every echo carried like a whisper of intent. Evangeline paused, pen hovering above the page, a breath catching in her throat. She knew the rhythms of this house. When the servants retired, when the coal in the downstairs furnace was fed, when Cornelius made his late-night rounds, this was none of those. This was deliberate, slower than a servant's pace, heavier than her own. She reached for the silver locket at her throat, a piece Margaret had noticed earlier, but never questioned. Inside was not a portrait or a lock of hair, but something far more dangerous. A folded scrap of parchment containing the names of 3 men who could destroy the circle if they lived long enough to speak. 2 were already dead. The 3rd was in hiding, somewhere beyond Pittsburgh's grasp. Evangeline had promised him she would get this name into the right hands. The footsteps stopped. She could feel, rather than hear, the presence outside her study door. The brass key to her desk pressed cold against her skin. In the grate, the fire hissed, a single coal popping, the sound unnervingly loud. Her pen scratched out the final sentence of the final page. "If this reaches you, I am gone." She slid the pages into a manila envelope and sealed it with wax from the candle beside her. For a moment, she simply stared at it, not as a collection of paper, but as a weapon. A blade sharper than steel, one that could cut the circle's throat if wielded by the right hand. Then, a knock. Not polite. 3 heavy raps that made the glass in the window tremble. She did not answer. The handle turned, testing the lock. Evangeline's mind raced. The servants' quarters were too far, the main staircase too exposed, but the house had other paths, passages built into its bones for staff to move unseen. Few knew them all. She did. She gathered the envelope, the locket, and, almost as an afterthought, the emerald gown draped across her chair. It would have to be part of the misdirection. If Cornelius wanted to believe she'd been taken in the night, she would make sure the scene was perfect. Outside, the footsteps resumed, this time moving away. A retreat, or the long arc of a predator circling for the strike. Every mansion of power has a skeleton map, corridors meant for ghosts, not guests. The ones who learn them aren't supposed to live long enough to tell. Evangeline rose from the desk, the envelope pressed to her chest. She moved to the far wall, where a mahogany bookcase sagged slightly under the weight of ledgers. Her fingers found the 3rd shelf, the spine of a faded volume on industrial architecture. She pulled, and the entire section of shelving shifted forward with a groan, revealing a narrow gap cut into the stone. Cold air spilled out, smelling faintly of damp mortar and coal dust. This was one of the mansion's service passages, designed so footmen could move unseen between wings during galas. Cornelius never used them. That was the point. His arrogance made him believe all space in the house belonged to him. But Evangeline had discovered these channels in her first year, walking them in silence, learning their blind turns and hidden exits. She stepped inside, closing the shelf behind her. Darkness swallowed her. Gone swallowed her. She counted her steps. 10 forward, 3 down, another 6 into a narrower shaft that curved around the grand ballroom's back wall. Here the sounds of the house changed. Pipes groaned. Somewhere below, a furnace door clanged shut. Somewhere above, a floorboard whispered under a shifting weight. The gown bundled under her arm was heavy, the beading pressing cold patterns into her skin. She paused in the dark, her breathing loud in her ears. She could not carry the evidence out tonight. The city was too dangerous, and the circle's reach too wide. But she could hide it. In a place even Cornelius's men wouldn't think to look. A turn in the passage brought her to a low wooden door. It opened into a forgotten part of the servants' wing, a disused linen closet beneath the old ice house. She knelt, pried up a warped floorboard, and slid the envelope inside. The locket stayed with her. For a moment, she allowed herself the smallest breath of victory. The papers were hidden. The circle could burn the mansion to the ground and still not find them. But as she stood to leave, a faint glimmer caught her eye through a crack in the door, the reflection of lamplight on metal. Someone was waiting in the passage, not moving, just standing, listening. There is a silence more dangerous than footsteps, the silence of someone who has already decided what to do with you. Evangeline froze, one hand braced against the rough frame of the closet door. Through the narrow gap, she could see the dull shimmer of brass, The curved edge of a lamp reflector, its light carefully hooded to keep the beam from spilling too far. Whoever held it knew these passages well enough to move without betraying themselves. She felt the weight of the locket at her throat, its chain digging into her skin. Her instinct was to run, but in these corridors, movement made sound, and sound would make her prey. Instead, she pressed herself against the shadowed wall and waited. The figure didn't advance. It lingered, the faint light quivering as if balanced in one hand. Then a whisper, not to her but to someone else farther back in the dark. She caught only a fragment. She came through here. The voice was low, male, and unfamiliar. Not one of the servants. Not Cornelius, which meant circle. Her heartbeat was so loud she feared they would hear it. Slowly, she slid her hand into the folds of the gown she carried, feeling for the concealed pin. A slender steel hair ornament, sharp enough to pierce skin if used properly. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. Nothing. The lamp shifted again, and this time the light fell across a sliver of the watcher's face, pale, hollow-eyed, with the tight, deliberate stillness of someone who kills without hesitation. He was listening, not for footsteps, for breathing. Evangeline took the smallest breath possible, then pressed her palm to the warped floorboard she'd replaced over the hidden envelope. If she didn't make it out, this spot would have to be found by someone else. She silently counted to 10, timing the beat of the furnace below, and when its iron door slammed again, she moved. Not forward, back, into an even narrower chute behind the linen shelves, where the wood smelled of mildew and the ceiling scraped her hair. It was a servant's bypass she'd discovered months ago, one so tight a grown man would have to crouch. She pulled the panel shut behind her, sealing herself in darkness again. The man with the lamp didn't follow. Not yet. But the light didn't move away either. It waited. It waited. Predators don't chase immediately. They let you believe you've slipped away, so you'll walk right into their teeth. The wood of the bypass pressed in on all sides, the stale air thick with the scent of rotting cloth. Evangeline could feel the faint vibration of footsteps through the floorboards beyond the wall. Measured, patient, the kind of steps meant to herd rather than hunt outright. She began to crawl. Each movement was careful, her elbows dragging over splintered beams, the steel pin still clutched in her hand. She counted the turns in the shaft, right past the old dumbwaiter shaft, left where the plaster flaked into her hair, then another left toward the disused pantry. She knew the path ended near a back stair that descended into the coal tunnels beneath the estate. Dangerous in their own right, but safer than being cornered in the upper halls. A faint scrape made her pause. Not from ahead, from behind, from behind. She held still, barely breathing, and the sound came again, the unmistakable rasp of fabric against wood. Someone had found the entrance she used, and they were small enough, or desperate enough, to follow. The space was so tight she couldn't turn to see them. Her mind began to map the angles. Whoever it was would have to crouch low, limiting their reach. That meant if she could reach the next vertical drop, she could disappear before they closed the distance. She pushed forward faster now, the gown's beading snagging on rough boards. Twice she almost cried out as wood splinters bit into her hands, but she forced the sound back into her throat. The pin in her grip became slick with sweat. Then, light, not from behind, but ahead. A dull orange glow spilling through a gap in the paneling. She reached it and peered out into the old pantry. Shelves stripped bare decades ago, dust dancing in the lamplight from a single swinging lantern. For a heartbeat, relief stirred. The room was empty. Until the lantern's swing slowed, and she saw it was hanging from a hook directly above the pantry door. The door was ajar, and in the narrow shadow between door and frame, a man's eye watched the dark. Not searching, waiting. Whoever was behind her in the shaft wasn't her only pursuer. Odd. Traps don't always close with a snap. Sometimes they seal with a slow, patient tightening. Evangeline's pulse roared in her ears. The pantry ahead was a dead end if she entered. Behind her, the muffled scrape in the bypass came again, closer this time. Whoever followed had found their rhythm, moving without hesitation. The man at the door still hadn't blinked, his gaze fixed on the panel. She crouched behind, as if he could sense her breathing through the wood. She scanned the cramped space for another way out. Above, the ceiling boards sagged under years of neglect, spiderwebs draping like fine lace. A narrow seam marked where a maintenance hatch once opened to the attic crawlspace. It was risky. The wood might not hold her weight, but risk was better than being pinned between two predators. She shifted the gown to her back, braced her palms against the opposite walls, and began to climb, wedging herself upward. The old boards groaned in protest, a sound that made the man at the pantry door tilt his head slightly, like a wolf catching a scent. From behind came a low, deliberate grunt. The follower in the shaft had seen her move. She reached the hatch, fingers scrabbling at the warped edge. Dust rained into her face as she shoved upward. The panel lifted just enough for her to squeeze through into a space so low she had to crawl on her stomach. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with the smell of dry rot and old insulation. Beneath her, the pantry door creaked open. Open. She heard the soft tap of boots on the wooden floor, followed by the faint click of metal. A revolver's cylinder being checked. She crawled toward a faint glimmer ahead, moonlight filtering through a vent in the eaves. Her knees burned against the splintered boards, and every movement felt loud in the suffocating space. Behind her, the shaft follower reached the pantry, joining the armed man. They spoke in low tones, their words indistinct, except for one, her name. Evangeline, not shouted, not even called, just spoken softly, almost tenderly, as if coaxing her to answer. She didn't. She kept moving toward the vent, but when she reached it and peered through the slats, her stomach knotted. Below, in the courtyard, bathed in silver moonlight, stood Cornelius himself, looking up at the eaves as though he'd been expecting her all along. The most dangerous smile is the one that pretends to understand you. Cornelius stood motionless in the courtyard, his long coat stirring faintly in the night breeze. The moonlight caught on the silver edge of his watch chain, the same one Evangeline had seen him wrap around a man's wrist months ago. Not in friendship, but restraint. "You've made this very hard for me," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach her through the vent slats. It wasn't loud, but there was an intimacy in the tone that made her skin crawl. He didn't look around, didn't search the shadows. His eyes were locked precisely on the vent where she crouched, as if her heartbeat was loud enough to guide him. Behind her, the attic boards creaked. The two pursuers were coming closer, their boots muffled but deliberate. Jurt, muffled but deliberate. Cornelius tilted his head slightly at the sound and smiled. Slow, calculated. "They're not here for me," he continued, as if they were speaking alone. "And they're not here for what you're carrying. They're here for you." "But you already know that, don't you?" Evangeline stayed silent, her throat tight. She edged her hand toward the vent's latch, testing it. It was rusted, but with enough force it might give, though the drop to the courtyard would be brutal, and Cornelius would be right there. "If you come down," he said, "I can make them stop. I can tell them you're under my protection, but you have to choose now." The attic behind her darkened. The pursuers had blocked what little moonlight seeped in. She felt their presence before she heard the first footstep on the beam behind her. Cornelius's voice softened. "Don't make me watch them take you." The rusted latch gave a tiny metallic pop. The sound seemed to echo forever in the stillness. Both in front and behind, they moved at the same time. Survival isn't about choosing the right path. It's about choosing the one where you can still move. Evangeline's fingers tightened around the rusted latch, the metal biting into her skin. The boards behind her trembled with each step the pursuers took, dust sifting down over her back. Cornelius remained perfectly still below, his hands folded loosely before him as though the outcome had already been decided. The voices behind her whispered now, not to each other, but to her. Soft coaxing, promises. A woman's voice this time, low and smooth, almost maternal, telling her she was tired, that she didn't have to run anymore. Her jaw clenched. The choice wasn't between safety and danger. It was between one kind of trap and another. She wrenched the latch. It gave with a screech, and cold night air surged in, sharp and bracing. The vent panel swung outward on a rusted hinge, and without a second thought she drove her shoulder through the opening. The air rushed past her ears, the drop shorter than she feared but still enough to jar her bones when she landed in a crouch, her palms scraped against the courtyard's gravel, sharp stones tearing at her skin. Cornelius didn't move toward her. He simply stepped aside, leaving the path to the gate unobstructed. His gaze followed her like a shadow. "Run," he said quietly, almost kindly. Her instincts screamed that it was wrong, that no predator opens the cage without a reason. But the attic window above burst open, and the two figures emerged, one of them already dropping to the roof to cut her off. She ran, her skirts tangled around her legs, and her lungs burned in the cold air, but she didn't look back. The gravel path curved sharply toward the estate's outer wall, and just beyond, she saw the faint outline of the iron gate. Then something moved in the shadows ahead, not one figure, but three. standing side by side, waiting. A trap is most effective when it lets you believe there's still a way out. The three figures ahead didn't rush her. They simply stood at the gate, their silhouettes black against the pale wash of moonlight. Each wore the same long, high-collared coat, the fabric catching faint silver edges where the light touched it. Their hands were clasped before them, not in prayer, but in a strange mirrored posture that looked rehearsed. Evangeline slowed, her breath ragged, scanning for gaps. The gate was only 10 feet away, but their stillness was more unnerving than a charge. Behind her, boots crunched on gravel, Cornelius's measured pace, and above, the soft thud of the roof pursuer dropping down. She was caught between two walls of closing teeth. "You're not running from them," one of the gate figures said, voice deep and resonant. "You're running to us." Her stomach dropped. She glanced to the left, a hedge so thick it was nearly a wall. To the right, a narrow path curling into shadow, but it hugged the estate wall, a dead end if guarded. Ooh. The air shifted. A sudden metallic groan came from above the gate, and she looked up just in time to see a heavy chain slither down, locking into place with a dull, final click. The way out was gone. Cornelius's voice carried over the courtyard. "You see now why I told you to stop." Evangeline backed away, forcing her breathing to steady. The three at the gate began moving, not toward her, but apart, fanning out to pen her in from every angle. From the corner of her eye, she saw the others closing in from behind. The circle was forming. Somewhere deep in the house, a bell began to toll. Slow, heavy, one strike for each step they took toward her. She realized it wasn't just a signal for them, it was a countdown. When the circle closes, the world outside it no longer exists. The bell's final toll rang out, vibrating in her ribs. Then, silence. Every figure froze as if bound by the sound itself. Their eyes, every one of them, fixed on Evangeline. She felt it, a pressure like invisible hands pushing her toward the exact center of the courtyard. The ground beneath her boots gave a faint shiver. A seam appeared in the gravel, thin but perfect, forming a ring around where she stood. Cornelius stepped forward, his expression unreadable. A step outside it, and you'll be dead before you touch the gate. The seam widened, a black gap opening in the earth. From within came the sound of moving water. No, not water. Whispering. Dozens of voices overlapping, speaking in a language she didn't know but somehow felt in her bones. The circle's edge glowed faintly, a dim reddish light that pulsed with the rhythm of her heartbeat. One of the figures near the gate produced a small object, a silver key, long and thin. Without a word, he tossed it into the circle. It landed at her feet, warm as if it had been sitting in fire. "Choose," Cornelius said. "Take it and join us, or stand here until the ground takes you." The whispers grew louder, pulling at her thoughts. She realized with sudden clarity that the voice she'd heard in the attic, the woman's voice, was among them. Every choice feels like freedom until you realize who offered it to you. Evangeline stared at the key, its metallic surface catching the dim red glow from the circle's edge. Her breath misted in the cold air, the sound of her heartbeat deafening against the courtyard's silence. Her fingers twitched, reaching without thinking, before she caught herself. The key was too easy, too deliberate. She looked up, meeting Cornelius's eyes. "If I take it, I'm one of you." He didn't smile, but there was a faint spark of approval in his gaze. "And if you don't, you're nothing." The gap in the ground widened another inch, pebbles sliding into the blackness. The whispers swelled into something almost like a song, threads of sound winding around her thoughts, softening her resistance. Behind Cornelius, the three gate figures had stopped fanning out, their heads tilted slightly, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. She shifted her stance, her right foot brushing the very edge of the glowing ring. It flared brighter at her touch, and for an instant, she thought she saw shapes moving in the darkness below. Pale hands reaching upward, fingers curling as if eager to pull her down. The key lay inches away. A single movement would claim it. A single step the other way would mean the drop. But there was still a third option, the one every hunter dreads. She could break the circle. Circles hold power because no one dares to cross them. Evangeline shifted her weight, ignoring the way Cornelius's eyes narrowed. She bent slightly as if to grab the key, and then with a sudden burst of motion, slammed her heel into the glowing ring's edge. The effect was instant. The red light shattered outward like glass, fragments streaking into the night before vanishing. The whispers below turned into screams, furious, desperate, inhuman. The ground buckled. A sharp wind roared up from the gap, carrying with it a stench of damp earth and something older, fouler. Cornelius lunged forward, but the disruption rippled through the courtyard like a shockwave, sending him staggering back. The three gate figures clutched their heads, their rigid formation breaking for the first time. Evangeline dove toward the narrow path by the estate wall, the one she had dismissed as a dead end. But now the wall itself trembled, small stones breaking loose as if the very foundation of the estate was straining under the circle's collapse. Behind her, the screams became a single deafening roar, and she risked one glance over her shoulder, only to see the black gap widening uncontrollably, swallowing the gravel, the hedges, and the boots of one of the gate figures as he vanished into the dark. "You have no idea what you've done." Cornelius's voice cracked, half fury, half fear. She didn't look back again. The wall ahead was splitting, and through the growing fracture, she could see the faintest glimmer of light. Sometimes the light at the end of the tunnel is just another trap with better lighting. The fracture in the wall widened as Evangeline sprinted toward it, shards of stone biting into her hands as she squeezed through. The glow beyond wasn't daylight. It was a cold, bluish shimmer that seemed to come from the air itself. She stumbled into a narrow corridor lined with walls of black slate. The air was thick, humming faintly, as though she'd stepped inside the body of a living thing. Every footstep echoed unnaturally, the sound repeating in strange patterns, as if the corridor was remembering her movements. Behind her, the roar from the courtyard was fading, but so were Cornelius's shouts. Either he couldn't follow her in here, or he wouldn't. The light grew brighter as she moved deeper, revealing symbols carved into the slate, circular, interlocking shapes with delicate lines weaving between them like veins. Some pulsed faintly, keeping pace with her heartbeat. Then she saw it, a chamber at the corridor's end, perfectly round, with a pedestal at its center. Resting on it was a glass orb, swirling with the same cold light that filled the air. She took a step inside, and the doorway behind her sealed with a sound like stone grinding on bone. The chamber darkened for a heartbeat, and when the light returned, she wasn't alone. A woman stood across from her, dressed in a long, tattered gown, her skin as pale as the orb's glow. Her eyes were entirely black, but her voice was the same one Evangeline had heard in the attic. "Oh, you broke their circle," the woman said softly, "and now you've stepped into mine. An enemy's enemy isn't always your friend. Sometimes it's just a bigger enemy with better timing." Evangeline's pulse spiked, her back instinctively pressing against the cold slate wall. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her voice sounded smaller than she wanted. The woman stepped closer, the orb's glow bending toward her as though drawn to her presence. "Our names don't hold here," she said. "Only debts, and you've just created one." Evangeline glanced at the orb. Evangeline glanced at the orb. Its swirling light now moved faster, a storm caught in glass. She felt a pull toward it, the same compulsion she'd felt toward the key in the courtyard. But this was heavier, more dangerous. "Cornelius feared you," Evangeline said slowly, testing the waters. Nah. The woman tilted her head, a faint smile curling her lips. "Cornelius fears many things, but me." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking on Evangeline's. "He fears what I remember." A faint tremor ran through the chamber, the symbols on the walls flaring for an instant. Evangeline realized they weren't just markings, they were restraints, pulsing with the same rhythm as the woman's slow, deliberate breaths. "Why am I here?" Evangeline asked. "Because you broke what should never have been broken," the woman replied, circling the pedestal. "And now I can't decide if I should thank you or finish what they started." The orb fled suddenly, and 1,000 ghostly voices spilled into the room, all whispering the same word, her name. When something calls your name in the dark, it's rarely because it wants to help you. The whispers thickened until Evangeline felt them crawling across her skin, threading into her ears, her mind. Each time they said her name, it was in a slightly different tone, pleading, mocking, warning. The woman's black eyes never left her. "They know you now," she said almost tenderly. "Bui." "Oh, once they know you, they don't forget." The orb's light flared again, this time lashing out in thin, tendril-like streams. One brushed Evangeline's arm and ice shot through her veins, numbing her fingers. She staggered back, but the tendrils followed, curling around her like smoke with weight. "Touch it," the woman urged. "End the calling before it pulls you apart." Evangeline's chest tightened. Her instincts screamed to run, but the sealed doorway was still behind her, and the slate walls looked as though they'd absorb her if she pressed against them for too long. Another tendril caught her wrist. Her vision blurred, and for a split second she saw flashes of faces. Dozens, maybe hundreds. pressed against some unseen barrier, their mouths open in silent screams. "What happens if I do?" Evangeline asked through clenched teeth. The woman's smile widened. "You'll either master it, or it will wear you like a mask." The orb pulsed once more, harder this time. Every voice spoke at once, not her name but a single command: "Take me." Some choices don't have a right answer, only consequences. Evangeline's breath came sharp and fast. The tendrils tightened, their cold sinking deeper until it felt like her very bones were shivering. The orb's storm swirled violently now, every flicker of light pulling her closer. She reached out, her fingertips brushed the glass, and the world inverted. The chamber vanished. She was falling, tumbling through a void where the faces she'd seen earlier now surrounded her in an endless ring, their whispers becoming a low, rising hum. The cold became heat, unbearable, scouring her from the inside. Then, silence. She was standing again, back in the chamber, but the orb was gone. Its light, its presence, was inside her. She could feel it coiled just beneath her skin, moving when she moved, breathing when she breathed. The woman stepped forward, studying her with an unreadable expression. "Reader, it chose you," she said softly. "That's either your salvation or your undoing." The symbols on the walls dimmed one by one until the slate was bare. The sealed doorway cracked open, a faint draft brushing past her face. Somewhere beyond, she could still hear faint echoes of Cornelius calling her name. But now, there was no fear in her. She walked toward the opening, the glow beneath her skin pulsing with each step. As she crossed the threshold, the woman's voice followed her, low and certain. "Whatever waits beyond that door will see you now, as one of us." She walked out with a power no human should hold. But powers like that always demand a price, and hers, it's already coming to collect.